hope you don't mind if I have something a little bit harder.
Look at you. Yeah, you'll have to let me know how the brand is too. Those
It's
Cutwater ones. I've seen them advertised, but I haven't actually had one.
this actually isn't the first time I've had one. I had one a couple weeks ago, and it does the job, especially on an empty stomach. But one thing that I got from this that I don't get from an actual mule is kind of not the hangover effect, but like, if you have one too many White Claws, that kind of weird shake feeling you get. But I had a dream last night where I was riding my lawnmower north on Broad Street past the old fishing hole.
Riding your push mower?
No, riding a riding mower.
Oh.
Which I don't have.
Well, I was gonna say you said you're riding your lawnmower, and I was thinking like the actual one you own.
No, like one I don't own, but somehow I had access to in my dream. I was riding it north past the old fishing hole down the street, and that fishing hole had been demolished, and a gas station had been put in, which I don't think would be the worst thing in the world. And there was a grizzly bear chained up in a parking spot, like an old timey saloon where people would tie up their horse to drink water while they go in and tie one on and fuck a hooker.
Did the grizzly bear have a saddle on it though?
It didn't have a saddle on it, but it did break loose when I was riding past on my lawnmower. So I was giving it as much gas as I could.
Grizzly bears are fast.
They are.
Even if you got that thing in sixth, you ain't really gonna outrun the grizzly bear.
Even if you had a 0-turn mower, it wouldn't do the job. But I was hauling ass, and I made it, and I can't remember what it was, but I somehow lured it into my garage and trapped it there. And then I had to go find a gun so I could shoot the bear in the face that was in my garage. But
couldn't just let the bear go. Had to finish the job.
Some things you can't forgive. You let them out of the gas station, and the next thing you know, they're riding unicycles down the streets.
Yeah, that's a pretty weird one.
Oh, hey everyone. My name's Kyle.
I'm Jason.
And we're here to talk to you today about 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence by Dream Theater.
Yeah, celebrating its 20th anniversary this year, which is crazy, and it makes me feel old, and I'm sure it makes you feel old.
It does.
Really interesting record. So we're kind of going to go into detail about the tracks, the production ethos of the record, the compositional ethos, kind of what it meant to the band's career, and what it continues to mean to the band going forward.
So I think a good question then is, in the overall hierarchy of Dream Theater records, as we stand in 2022, where do you place this album?
So it's interesting for me because, I can think back to when I first got into Dream Theater and was first introduced to them, I should say, in probably like the mid 20-aughts, so probably about 2004, 2005 was really when I was introduced to Dream Theater. And it wasn't so much in a progressive music context, it was more the guitar playing kind of sphere, right?
Sure.
Because I was getting into guitar playing, I was getting into lead guitar playing, the neoclassical thing, and obviously a lot of those, progressive metal guys are kind of spoken of in those same circles. So the Petrucci's, the Michael Romeos, et cetera, et cetera. So it was interesting because at that time, I think the newest record when I got into Dream Theater that had come out was Train of Thought. And it was funny because I kind of like danced around a lot of what would be considered their classic material until really, I think it was a music theory class, you recommended to me Scenes from Memory, because prior to that, I hadn't really even checked it out. I was firmly listening to Train of Thought, 6 Degrees, Awake, but I didn't really listen to Images and Words or Scenes from Memory or Falling into Infinity or, and Dream and Day Unite or any of that stuff. So when I look back upon it, I always have to ask myself, and it's certainly something I kind of want to dive into a little bit more and talk about as we have our discussion here, but I always try to look at records from that period of Dream Theater's history, and I try to remove the nostalgia factor because those records were so important to me because of when I was getting into them. So I look very fondly at Train of Thought and 6 Degrees and even Octavarium because they were very important in my musical development. But now looking at their body of work, as you said, 2022, where does it really sit? I mean, I think it's one of their stronger records. It certainly means a lot to me. I don't know if history will judge it that way. I don't know what your opinion is, but that's kind of where I would tentatively put it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a good assessment. I too think it's a really good record. Um, I like I don't know if I had to do a ranking, it wouldn't be near the top, but it definitely wouldn't be anywhere near the bottom, right? It would probably sit somewhere upper middle. Um, I think it honestly may be the second to last great Dream Theater record. Um, there's it's weird. Um, it's weird. I would I kind of equate this album. I'm not sure how much of a Trekkie you are, but this album for me is like season two of Star Trek: The Next Generation. The good tracks are really good, some of the best things that the band has ever done, and the bad songs are pretty bad on there.
Interesting.
Actually, I don't know if I'd call them bad, but there's a couple songs on here where, comparatively speaking, the tracks that are on this record and the tracks that came on previous albums and one or two albums after that, I think it has some of the more forgettable tracks on there. I guess bad is maybe a little bit strong, but high highs and, at least for me, low lows. I do think this is the album where Dream Theater kind of started turning the corner from being a progressive rock metal act, and having very kind of thematic writing style, and kind of did an about face and turned into the Dream Theater riff factory and just kept pumping them out every 2 years, which is interesting because this was recorded 2 years after Scenes from a Memory and came out only 1 year before Train of Thought. So there was a lot of stuff going on, but you can hear a lot of stuff in this record that I feel like has kind of bogged them down on subsequent records, even into the 2020s now. But there is still that kernel of really inspired songwriting that came before it and lasted a little bit after it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, that's interesting. So there's a few things there that I guess I disagree with, but there's a lot that I agree with, and I think for me primarily it's that sense that they started turning that corner, or that they started developing, at least in terms of their songwriting, those kind of archetypes that they would then go on to kind of exhaust in terms of what you can really do with that form.
Yeah.
For instance, and I'm sure we can kind of talk more details, but like one of the things that I think they're really known for now is they do these long 13-minute long song, and it has all these trade-offs, and they're doing this pentatonic, big heavy pentatonic 7-string riff that Petrucci comes in with, and then the keyboard lead part, and then they're trading off for a while, and there's that kind of an odd time riff in the background, et cetera, et cetera. And it's funny because every time I revisit this record, I like hear a song like a Blind Faith. I love that song. It's one of my favorite Dream Theater songs. I love it. But it's interesting that you can kind of see the root of some of what that would develop into later. And I'd say arguably say as time went on, was diluted in some way, because I think the ideas at that point in time were there to support that form.
Yes.
And that being said, that kind of one of the first times they did that, kind of long form thing where it has that section, kind of the instrumental breakdown, I guess you could say, or like the instrumental section, which they've always kind of been known for. But yeah, there's that era there where, to me, there's a true shift after Octavarium. And I think everything after that has felt different, even before Portnoy exited the band. Like everything from Systematic Chaos onward just kind of had a different vibe to it. And I think a lot of that is that initial well of kind of not only inspiration and creativity, but I think just that initial well of being open to experimentation.
Yes.
Being open to different stylistic things, different genres. I think that's part of what I really appreciate about 6 Degrees, although it's a much more kind of varied release, and some of that sticks and some of it doesn't. It's a much more varied release than even like a Scenes from a Memory, which to me is very focused in kind of what it tries to do.
Yes.
And I think purposely so, right? It's interesting to me, and part of the reason I think I give so much credence and respect to 6 Degrees is that it's one of the last times they really went for it with that experimentation. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but it was cool to see them kind of operating outside that bounds of, metal, prog. They do some really interesting different things in there.
They do. And I sat down and I tried to think, okay, what is it specifically is different about late 20 aughts, early 2010s, and onward Dream Theater and the earlier Dream Theater? And I'm trying to think of different moments that, at least to me, were really cool and inspired about the earlier records and how the different records later on down the line kind of feel different. And I mean, I get it, right? Like, you should evolve and write different stuff as a songwriter. I think that's a sign of maturity. That's not necessarily a sign of being stale as a band in most respects. I think where this album kind of signaled a turning point is focusing more on the destination than the journey. And what I mean by that, take a classic Dream Theater song, a classic like Take the Time, right? My favorite part in that song, I don't know about you, is the unison guitar keyboard solo between Kevin Moore and John Petrucci. That's like the most triumphant sounding thing. And it's like, okay, if you take that riff alone, pull it out, and examine it in a vacuum, it's cool. The playing is good. But could you really differentiate that from a really cool, intricate passage in latter era Dream Theater stuff? Probably, but not as much. To me, what makes that section really effective is the slow build up before it, what comes after it. It's the context. It's the fact that they had all these statements that they wanted to make, and what was really inspired about it was how they got from one idea to the next and really served the song in that way. They were focusing, here's this main riff, how do we get to it as effectively as possible, and how do we want to say this? Whereas more recent records, it's like, here's a riff. Okay, we're not going to have any regard for what the context of that riff is. Here's another riff. I was listening to, what's that, the latest one that came out?
View from the Top of the World.
I was listening to View from the Top of the World, and it kind of struck me like there was one or two songs in, and it just like switched gears like 5 times in a row, but not in a good way, right? It was like, here's a riff, here's a different riff, and it's like there's no thread going through it that kind of strings all these, admittedly well-played ideas into one cohesive thought.
Yeah. No, I think there's something to that. Because the comparison is inevitable, right? And I've spent some time now because we've kind of gone back and forth in this and talked, obviously off the record, but we've talked about, their recent output and kind of the direction that's taken. And I will definitely say, that Dramatic Turn of Events, I love that record. Beyond that to self-titled and then into the Astonishing, certainly cool stuff in parts in those, and maybe a song here or there really struck out to me. I love Life Left Behind is awesome. That's a great Dream Theater song of any era. But I think by and large, that is kind of the issue I've had, regardless of who's playing with the band. I know people like to get bogged down in this Mike versus Mike and all this other sort of stuff. Doesn't matter. I think to me, what I really look for is that cohesion and that sense of, being adventurous, because it kind of comes down now to like that old man notion of progressive, right? What's progressive? Is progressive a style in that it's a, form of songs that you write, and it's got to have the A, the B, the C, the D, the instrumental section, whatever. It's got to be 20 minutes long. Or is it really trying to push those boundaries and do something different? Is it about time signatures and solos, or is it about, an ethos, kind of an overarching thing? And I probably then would have said the time signatures and the solos and whatnot, but now I think I would really say it's more about that ethos. And I think you listen to a song like the title track on A View from the Top of the World, and there's certainly sections in there and riffs that are awesome. I think there's a section, like maybe around 6 or 7 minutes into the song, where there's that really cool bass lick. I don't know if you really dived in that deep, but there's this really cool, Mi-young bass section that's just really tasty, and there's a cool build in there. But then as soon as it feels like maybe they're going to develop that idea, it's over, and then they go to a chorus, and then it's on to the next section. And that's part of what I kind of miss in their their epics, or the epics at least they've tried to put together in this later era. I think that the title track on 6 Degrees perfectly exemplifies that compositional kind of excellence and attention to detail that they had, that building of themes, especially with the overture. No matter how cheesy the cheesy keys, orchestral arrangements that Rudess put together, are now in 2022 standards compared with 2002. Kind of similar thing with like the Odyssey, which is one of my all-time favorite songs. But it can be cheesy in a regard, but it's cool.
I think dated might be.
Yeah. But the music itself, has so much value just because it's so well orchestrated and well composed and just well thought out. And then the fact that, throughout that piece, you have all these themes and things that are coming back up that really are developed. It has what I think you're getting at, that sense of payoff, that sense of when you hear that main theme coming back in, like Goodnight Kiss, or towards the end of that song as it starts transitioning into I almost said Salisbury Hill, Solitary Shell.
Well, we'll get into that.
When it transitions, like that's such a big moment, and I feel like that's something that is kind of missed in modern Dream Theater. Not that again, you said I think View from the Top of the World is one of the best productions and best mixes they've ever had. Andy Sneap, destroyed it. It sounds phenomenal. Yeah. The playing is great as always. Mangini, phenomenal performance. Petrucci, phenomenal as always. You can hear everything. But I agree. There's something about the mojo of that era of the band, and specifically for me, that early 2000s, late 90s era of the band, that there's just something there.
Well, and it's interesting you say that, touching on the production, and I guess this is as good of a time as any to get into some technical details with the album. So, I'm sure we all know the main lineup of the band at this point in time. Obviously, we've got Mike Portnoy on drums, John Petrucci on guitar, John Mayung on bass, James Labrie on vocals, and Jordan Rudess on keyboard. Additional personnel: Howard Portnoy, the gong drum on Great Debate, which is a cool little touch.
Yep.
Production: Doug Oberkircher, engineer; JP Sheganowski, assistant engineer; Kevin Shirley, mixing, which I don't know about you, going back and listening to this album in full for the first time in a few years, little bit difficult to listen to. And I don't know, like Kevin Shirley is a fine mixer and producer. He's had a tremendous body of work, a lot of Dream Theater classics among that. So I don't know if that was like a Portnoy thing. For me, what really gets me is the overall kind of almost over-compressed feeling on it. And then the kick drum on this album kills me.
Oh, yeah.
Just,
Well, it's funny to me, I actually look back at the Kevin Shirley mixed Dream Theater stuff pretty fondly. But it's interesting because it's, I almost view it as after they got through that era of the Kevin Shirley mixes, they kind of fumbled and stumbled for a little while until they've just recently, I think, with their last 2 records, finally kind of got to a place where they're being kind of renowned again for their production. The Sneap production that they had, I think it was their engineer, I think it was like, is it Jimmy T? Or I don't want to get the name wrong, but on Distance Over Time. I also liked that mix, especially coming off of Astonishing and Self-Titled, which were rough in certain regards. There were certainly things on there that were very distracting. So I look back on that era fairly fondly, and maybe again it's just the nostalgia talking, which I'm doing my best to try to be objective and remove that nostalgia goggles from it. But I like the sound of it. I do, and I think I like the sound of the kick drum on this more so than say I'd like the kick drum on like a Train of Thought, which to me I would rank Train of Thought above 6 Degrees even just for what it meant to me, and I think the strength of the compositions and kind of what they're trying to do. But to me, the drum sound on that album on the kick side is just you get that I always call it that muffled effect of the kick drums, especially when he's doing the fast double bass.
That's interesting, and I know what you're saying. For me, I think I'd reverse the order of the two. I don't prefer the tone of Train of Thought over most of things, especially for that kick drum, but I would prefer it over 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. But again, I think the redeeming factor in all of these is the fact that they're great songs, and I feel like any shortcomings or maybe creative decisions made on the part of not Kevin Shirley but the production team behind it was overshadowed by the strength of the playing and composition. Wrapping this up, additional mixing or assistant mixer Claudius Mittendorfer, which what a fucking awesome name that is. Wow. George Marino, the late great George Marino, mastering. Eugene U.E. Natazi, assistant mastering. And then, yeah, that's kind of the extent of the audio production team.
Yeah, and then I know, we kind of went right into the conversation because obviously, especially for us as musicians, as, players, as composers, producers, whatever, Dream Theater is obviously a huge influence. It has been, continues to be. It's always a band I'll stick with no matter what. I always give anything that they do a shot, so I think it's been easy for us to just segue right into a conversation as we always do or want to do anytime Dream Theater comes up. But for those of you that don't know or haven't listened to it, obviously 6 Degrees Inner Turbulence is a double album, and I believe it was Dream Theater's first double album. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of an interesting way to do it because, coming off of Scenes from a Memory, obviously that's a played through concept record, right? Kind of heralded as a modern progressive classic, one of the best, progressive rock metal albums of all time, right up there with the Dark Side of the Moons and the Operation Mindcrimes and, whatever. It was interesting that in 6 Degrees, they kind of took a bit of a multifaceted approach. So on disc 1, it's very much kind of these long-form experimental pieces. They really dive into a lot of different sounds, a lot of sounds of the day, kind of contemporary sounds, which I'm sure we'll get into because I think that's a pro and a con of the album. But then disc 2 is very much kind of in that compositional mold of the very long-form progressive piece where, as we said, it has an overture, it has all these different disparate movements that form this one piece of music, this 42-minute long piece of music, which I have to say, it's interesting because in some ways you almost divide your fan base a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. It's definitely a ballsy move to put out a record like that and call it done and say, yeah, this is what we're doing. This is our next album. Mm-hmm. I think they were kind of riding that wave of goodwill that they got from the progressive community after they kind of backed off the Falling into Infinity era and, had so much success with the Scenes album and that new lineup and Rhodes and the band as kind of a compositional presence, I think they really just entered that era of, to me, that the band really from Scenes to Octavarium just seemed unstoppable. Mm-hmm. They just had so many ideas. They were a mile a minute. As you said, all the songs were good or strong. I mean, I'd probably say the weakest of those 4 albums is Octavarium, and I enjoy Octavarium. I can put Octavarium on, and to me, the strength of even like the song Octavarium or like Sacrifice Sons overshadows any of the perceived weaknesses of some of those shorter tracks or whatever. Just because like Octavarium is Octavarium, it's such a good song, in every way, and so it's interesting, it's a very interesting period, and I think now in 2022 we kind of look at that as their middle period, right? That's kind of their middle era. Yeah. They've got their first 10 years, that middle 10 years, and the last 10 years. They're kind of entering into a new decade now with what they've currently been working on. But as far as double album like that, they wouldn't really approach that again until The Astonishing, and obviously that was kind of its own thing. For better or worse. But what are your thoughts about that with, kind of the double album with the 42-minute piece on it and then the kind of the way they broke that up?
I think it's a double album done right and done for the right reasons. So in researching this, I found out, and I didn't know this, that Falling into Infinity was originally trying to be pushed as a double album by the band, which... I mean, who knows what that would have looked like and the shape it would have taken. I know it gets a lot of flack from old Dream Theater fans. I would say old as in older than either of us both being in our 30s. I know a lot of my older friends kind of think negatively of that record. I like that record quite a bit. I think there's a lot of good songy songs on there. But... yeah, so they were originally pushing for it. The label said, no, absolutely not. There's no way that's happening. And then they put out Scenes from a Memory, and Elektra's like, yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want. And I guess they were originally trying to fit it all into one record. And as they wrote the song Six Degrees of Inner Turbulence, it just kept getting longer, and people were bringing in more ideas. And then they finally approached the record label and said, like, hey, here's what we want to do. And they're like, yeah, sure, sounds great. And we're able to release it that way, which is cool. And that's the way it was released, with every iteration of each release, be it vinyl, CD, except for the cassette release, which is funny to think about
Yeah,
in
I know what you're
2022.
about to say. Yeah.
Yeah, in which they left Disappear off of, which, sorry, James, if one had to go. Uh, but, yeah, no. So I think they went about it the right way. I like this album a lot. I think it may be the greatest rip-off album of all time.
So it's funny you want to kind of go there, because that was one of my next kind of segues in terms of questions I wanted to ask you.
Yeah.
Because, as I said, too, this era of Dream Theater kind of being unstoppable, I think it's also the era, really from 6 Degrees, and then, that era arguably, I think, carried on through, probably Black Clouds, where they all of a sudden kind of had this shift to where it was very concerted, kind of trying to think of the best way to say it. It was a very concerted focus on trying to remain kind of contemporary by following contemporary influences, or other contemporaries of the band. So, like, I think if you listen back to really any of those early records, you listen back to Images, you listen back to Awake, you listen back to, Change of Seasons, for, what it's worth to add it in there, Falling into Infinity, Scenes, they all kind of had certain hallmarks of the identity of a progressive metal band or progressive rock sort of kind of tropes, in terms of the high vocal parts and the way things were layered and keyboard parts and whatever, right? But they kind of... it really cemented and developed the band's identity, I feel like, in those early years. And all of a sudden, in 6 Degrees, we start seeing a lot of this kind of creep from these other bands. Like, oh, that's kind of sounds a little bit like Tool. Mm-hmm. Oh, that kind of sounds a little bit like Pantera. Well, that kind of sounds a little bit like Radiohead. And, I know that was part of Portnoy's compositional process at the time, with the 5 CDs on the mixing board, and here's what everyone's listening to. But, it's interesting, because that is kind of a criticism of that era of Dream Theater.
Well, I think those influences had been there since the very beginning. I remember listening to the God, I don't have any fucking life. I remember listening to the commentary track on 5 Years in a Lifetime, and there's a portion on there where Portnoy's talking about picking James LaBrie up from the airport, and they were going to go right in and do Take the Time, and he was playing them, like, I don't know if it was Public Enemy tracks or something like that, to try to get, like, the delivery down and everything. So I think that's always been there. I think maybe what's different is twofold. A, maybe they are references or call-outs to bands that we would recognize more easily, and I think they might be a little bit more heavy-handed. That being said, I think a lot of the rip-off tracks on this album are great, right? I guess we should say, just because we're saying rip-off doesn't mean it's a negative. There's a lot of people out there who have gone after a sound, and they're not necessarily doing anything super original with it, but they're contributing more material in that vein. I think, John Schaefer for a long time was probably one of the better rip-off artists before he was bear macing senators. He had a lot of those Iced Earth albums, weren't necessarily original, but they had some good tunes on there that weren't necessarily inspired by anything completely unique. And I think it's the same thing with this. This is probably my favorite Tool album that's been released.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because it's like, if you go back and if you kind of pick apart, I would say more specifically Disc 1, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I remember at the time I was kind of breaking into a lot of different progressive music, right? So from One Direction, was being fed a lot of Symphony X and Dream Theater and kind of that real guitar-based kind of heavy, whatever, right? But then I was also being fed Tool, and I was also getting from, more my parents' direction, Yes, and Genesis, and ELP, and, Jethro Tull, specifically a lot of Jethro Tull. So it was like I was seeing different sides of kind of the progressive spectrum, right? But it was funny because I remember right around the same time I was getting into this record, I was also listening to 10,000 Days. And I'm listening to The Pot and Jambi and, all those songs, right? And Vicarious. So it was funny that I'm, listening to this stuff around the same time. And then I put on The Great Debate. And it's, a lot of those riff kind of motifs or the ways that they're playing with the time signatures and the way that, the tail kind of turns around is very reminiscent of something that Adam Jones would do or that Tool would do or had done before. Especially like 10,000 Days, maybe to a lesser extent, but you listen to like,
Lateralis.
Yeah, I'd say probably more Lateralis even than the early stuff. Like you can hear it, they're going after that sort of sound. Not to say they went after riffs per se, because I don't think they did, but there was a concerted, hey man, let's jam on something that kind of has the Tool vibe.
Yeah.
And we've done it too. Hey, let's jam on, I want to do something that's got a Behemoth vibe. I want to do something that's got a BT Bam vibe. I want to do something that's got a Dream Theater vibe.
Well, and I think it's interesting when you can do it, and again, the redeeming qualities of this album, you can do it in a way that, like, you can tell what they were listening to when they wrote the song, but that's still a Dream Theater song, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of those hallmarks of a good Dream Theater song that are present in there, and they were able to rip it off in a way that worked for them. And at least for me personally, like, I don't like Tool at all, and I think that's a more interesting Tool song than Tool's ever put out. I know you and a lot of other people have given me flack for that, but it's just like, I mean, if they can write that song in less than 2 months, it doesn't take you guys 15 years to come out with a new album.
Yeah, I being the Tool fan sitting down here tonight, I won't say anything, but I think that, it definitely has that vibe, but at the same time too, as you said, and I agree, it has a lot of those compositional hallmarks of Dream Theater that really elevate the material. So whereas, it could be easy to say, oh, it's homage, or they're taking that vibe, or they're taking that chord progression, or whatever, they do it in a way where it really it transcends, as you said, Tool, it transcends it, it has that vibe. And I think they did that better here than they would go on to do on later records. So like on Systematic Chaos, when you've got the Prophets of War and songs like that, that didn't work so well for me. I like a few songs on that record, but I skip that song every time, I'll be honest with you. But yeah, so okay, fine. We look at a song like Great Debate, which we just talked about. I think the ultimate, to me, success of this record, beyond just how ambitious the title track is, just because it's such an important suite of songs for me, was The Glass Prison, or is The Glass Prison. As a song, I love it. I love what they did. I love that it really, up to that point, was the heaviest thing that Dream Theater had done ever. I mean, even going back to Awake stuff, like, those songs are heavy, but they're not like Glass Prison heavy.
They're more like dark brooding type of heavy.
Yeah, very good way to put it, dark brooding. And then here's A Glass Prison. I remember the first time hearing that just 7-string intro when it comes in. It's like, whoa, what the hell is that? Because this is me learning not only about music, I'm learning about guitars, instruments. I don't know, 7-string guitar, what's that? That sounded so foreign to me. I have 5 of them now, but at the time it was like, and written albums with them, right? But at the time it was like, whoa, what the hell's going on? I didn't know about down tuning and all this other sort of stuff. But what a great piece. And to me, being the concept nerd that I am, and loving that conceptual nature of a lot of that stuff, that's one of the things I really appreciate and enjoy about Portnoy, is that he's so conceptually minded and really puts those kind of emphasis points into a lot of that background stuff that only the people that are going to be fanatical about it and really dive in are going to pick up on. Like me, I love it.
Oh yeah.
So the fact that not only did they start this multi-part sweet piece that's based on all these conceptual things surrounding the recovery program and Alcoholics Anonymous and all that. Like, it was just really cool to me the way it was approached. And then I think, but for me, I can give or take the last 3 parts of it, but I have on my Spotify right now a playlist that's literally The Glass Prison and This Dying Soul. And it ends after that. It's one perfect, in my opinion, 24-minute long song.
Yeah.
Progressive metal song. And I still, to this day, like, that's what I'm trying to capture. When I sit down with a 7-string guitar and I want to write a progressive metal song, I aim it towards The Glass Prison.
Well, and it's interesting you say that too, because we talked a lot about taking creative risks up to this point, and I feel like they really paid that off on this album, because on top of that song being up to that point the heaviest thing they'd ever done, there's a lot of other songs on there that breathe in a way that songs after this album haven't, and you could even argue songs before it happens. For me, the underdog track on this album, and one of my favorites, is Misunderstood. And I think that's something to where they are not eager to get to the next 1,000 notes in there. It really is more of a slow build, which, I mean, you could say, yeah, Change of Seasons was kind of a slow build, and it was, but I mean, they were going through a bunch of different phases. Like, Misunderstood is all one concept. It has a couple twists and turns that are tastefully done, but it was really like, okay, here's this theme, this idea, what do we do with this? Let's just write it and see what comes out. And I feel like that was a cool idea. And really, the individual second disc, and I know it's billed as a song, I've never thought of it as one song. I've always thought of it as, a bunch of extra tracks in a good way. And I feel like those individual songs or tracks have moments of that too, right? About to Crash, one of my favorites, Dream Theater songs. Salisbury Hill, or Solitary Shell, is great as well. Test That Stumped Them All, like, wow, what a far out sounding thing. But again, it has an idea that's fleshed out and is done for all, how long is that? 5 minutes and 3 seconds of that song. Like, it's, for being 8 different movements, there are some of the most songy songs I think they've composed, at least up to that point.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's the cool part too, is they, at least in their approach on the title track, it wasn't so much instrumental section. It wasn't so much, we're going to do this long, extended 4-minute trade-off full band thing, right? Which we love. I love when they do that and they do it effectively. But you're right, it was more about a bunch of song forms, and it was more a survey of stylistically where they were at and what they could do and what they could pull off at that point in time. There's a song that's a little bit more folky. I remember, and I know you would recall this as well, but like in the Budokan era, Live at Budokan era, that sparkly 12-string JP model
I remember
he
it
had.
vividly.
Yeah, double neck. How cool was that? Just like really interesting, because stylistically I feel like they ran the gamut, and that's impressive. I think as a listener, but as a musician, like to be able to have that sort of dynamic range to play that much different music and do it convincingly, I think is great, and that's one of the strengths of that piece. I always thought that they were at their best when they had a really strong song skeleton or foundation to revert back to, when they could always build up the song in that way, and it wasn't so much, the focus wasn't on those pyrotechnics. I think a thing I've taken to saying a lot lately is, a guitar solo is great, but the song can't be the vessel for the guitar solo.
Right.
The difference being, I think 20 years ago, say 20 years, I'm rounding up, but 18 years ago, 17 years ago, when I was writing music, I would write a solo and then try to write a song around the solo. Whereas nowadays, I even forget, does the song even have a solo? It might not, who knows? And if it needs one, okay, cool, I'll write one. But I think the focus should be first and foremost on that. And that's where I think the progressive nature, especially of the second disc, really comes through, because you're right, it isn't so much about the fireworks as it is about how strong is that form that they've kind of built up, and I think very strong.
Yeah, absolutely. So some lowlights of the album. And we talked about it a little bit already. I think in serving as kind of a transitionary record between classic Dream Theater and more contemporary Dream Theater, there's some things on there that don't age particularly well and haven't sat well. I think that some of the lyrical and thematic content, which I don't really care about lyrics a lot of the time, but for me, like the great debate, looking back on it, like the whole concept of that song, like, ugh, it's, and I get what they were trying to do at the time, like have a nonpartisan or non-biased view and be like, oh, hey, here's this moral question, and maybe it was a bigger deal back then, but now looking back on it 20 or holy shit, this is a good mule. Now looking back on it 20 years later, it's kind of like, maybe wasn't the best idea for a progressive rock band to jump into more of a political sphere. And I feel like that has kind of been a gripe of mine with Petrucci for a number of years, is when he's in charge of writing the song's lyrical and thematic content, it leaves a little bit to be desired, either from the actual, lyrical composition to like the idea. Like what I always go back to on what was Forsaken on? Was that Systematic Chaos?
Yeah, Systematic Chaos.
And like listening to the bonus DVD that came along with it, like, oh yeah, it's this song, and I'm like, okay, like what is this going to be about? Is this going to be, some religious quandary he had growing up, something that shaped him? He's like, oh yeah, it's some vampires that fly down and suck your blood out. I'm like, all right, John.
Hell yeah. Yeah, no, it's funny you say that too. Yeah, I think like I've always appreciated Dream Theater from a lyrical perspective more when everyone's contributing.
Yes.
The albums where just one member's writing the entire album have always kind of left a lot to be desired.
Mm-hmm.
The best lyricists in the band haven't been in the band for decades now. Kevin Moore's lyrics to me were always magical and continued to be in OSI and Chroma Key and all of his projects. So obviously he's a great writer, and I feel like kind of was hitting some nerve that was a little bit deeper than a lot of what would come after. But yeah, no, I agree. I will say that to counter that low light, I think that I like the conceptual stuff of that era where, Portnoy, there's things to be said with pros and cons and kind of what he brought to the band. I think from the conceptual standpoint, he was a huge voice, and it's definitely been felt since he has not been there, for as amazing of a player as Mangini is. And I love Mangini, I love Portnoy, like they're great. I'm not going down that road, but from a concept standpoint, I think it was that OCD nature of really thinking those things through and wanting to have some cool concept that then the band can develop or whatever. Like, I feel that because I'm that way. So I understand from that perspective. And I think maybe less so on disc one, but I really think 6 Degrees, the song, in trying to kind of talk about what it talks about in kind of a clumsy way, I still think it does a really good job, and it's a really cool conceit to base a conceptual piece after, when it was done as well as it was done.
That's a good point. I do think that's also a highlight of the album for me, is Portnoy's continued contribution to the overall direction of the band up to that point. And, you say OCD, and unless I'm incorrect and I'm about to commit, actionable slander or misinformation, I think he has been diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder.
I think so, yeah. I don't want to be wrong, but
but it's he says that he goes through periods of making lists about everything, and oh, here's my top 10 albums in this, and he's got everything alphabetized and is very very thorough with how he has his record collection laid out and stuff. So I mean, at the very least, if it isn't actual obsessive compulsive disorder, he's very particular about the way he likes things. And I think, to me, with that era of Dream Theater, that added to the mystique of the band. you've got the whole idea with the glass prison ending where this dying soul, no, not this dying soul, but the static that fades out.
Oh, the album, yeah.
Yeah. The transition between album, which is
the
cool.
meta album.
Exactly. You've got the whole thing with Octavarium, where if you look on the back of the album, each song is on a different key on the keyboard, and it's in, or at least starts in, some key of that note, which is awesome. You've got albums ending where the next one begins, so on and so forth, and it's, to me, that's really cool. Like you said, I think attention to detail is the right phrase there.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's something that I feel like was unique to Mike Portnoy, and only Mike Portnoy being in the band. I do think that's something where when they lost that, it was noticeable right away, for better or for worse. Because I mean, let's be honest, not every album that Mike Portnoy was on was great. There were some stinkers in there, especially towards the end, which I don't think we need to get into. But I do think that mystique, that level of attention to creativity is since left the band.
Yeah, no, I agree, and that's I definitely think that is a strong element of what he brought. So I really appreciated that. I think in terms of highlights for me, not to just pick out a song, because I think I highlighted how much I really enjoy the title track and how much I really enjoy Glass Prison and how that's been very influential on me as a musician, but just the care taken with a lot of the parts.
Yes.
And what I mean by that is, the individual instrumentation, and I always look to, I know you were joking about it earlier, but Disappear, I think, is a song where there's a lot of care kind of taken in the individual parts, how they come across, the dynamics of those parts. But one that always really strikes me, and I was thinking about this yesterday, as I was at work, and I am working, I'm doing my normal stuff, and I have one earbud in, and I was listening to Blind Faith, and that's a song I've listened to a million times before. Mm-hmm. But it always strikes me, that middle section, the middle kind of instrumental part, which we started this video with, right, talking about that. But just the way in which they ramp up the dynamics of that part, the way that for me as a guitar player, as a musician, I can tell the way he's accenting that low string to really make it pop out. Or he's doing, different things with his pick to make certain notes stand out more than others. Just that real kind of attention to dynamics and details and those little performance things that really, I think, make the part and then ultimately make the song. Mm-hmm. I think all of those records from that era, I guess that's my thesis, are kind of broader than the sum of their parts for that reason, because there was so much attention to detail being paid, really, by all the members of the band in different ways, but I think they were all kind of at the peak of their strengths on those records.
Absolutely. You've got an inspired Mike Portnoy. You've got a John Petrucci who is, while still being very sure of himself, is willing to go out there and take, his tone in this era and the rig he was using, I'm a huge fan of. You've got a singer who is coming to an understanding after eating a corrupted shrimp of where his vocal range is and what he can do and pull off convincingly, which I feel like, this era of Dream Theater, vocally, is really strong. I've enjoyed a lot of the vocal performances from Scenes from a Memory up through even Systematic Chaos. I think is pretty strong, and I think maybe the most important thing for me and the defining characteristic of where I kind of lost interest in the band is you've got Jordan Rudess playing notes and melodies instead of making sounds like a spaceship landing or sounding like he's sodomizing a hog or something,
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, it was funny today when I was listening to 6 Degrees again. He was using that patch. And I know you know what I'm talking about. He had a solo patch that he used through Liquid Tension and on Scenes, and he used it here. But this was really the last time he used it, and it was what I like to call the progressive rock Rudess patch, right? And it was when he still was kind of doing a lot of that type of stuff, where it was a solo, had a little bit more it was less kind of that off the cuff, spontaneous jamming sort of thing.
Yeah.
And granted, too, Jordan Rudess is an incredible musician.
Oh,
amazing
fuck yeah.
musician. Plays circles around me, you, anybody. Probably plays circles around us on guitar and whatever other instrument that we can somewhat play.
That's
right.
the truth.
And I love Rudess, and I love his like LTE3. Love that record. It was really good in my opinion. It was great, but I think I appreciate that restraint on some of these earlier records that we don't necessarily see anymore. Or, like I said, this was before the era of the blues, pentatonic trade-off that we've seen so much of, especially on the last couple records.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because the Kevin Moore era of the band, and to an extent the Derek Sherinian, version of the band, both very accomplished keyboardists, can do a lot of cool things, have a lot of cool things to say too. That's evident from Chroma Key and Planet X and everything else those guys have ever been in. And when Jordan Rudess comes in, okay, Scenes from a Memory, it's very clear where his influence was on that, but more or less, I think a lot of that album, and I could be wrong on this, but I feel like a lot of the ideas for that album were present before he was in the band, so I think it would be safe to say that this is the first album that he wrote on in a very significant way. And if this is your first statement coming in after, having other songs that you've had to perform or, arrange other ideas, I mean, he really does a good job with it. There's a lot of really strong melodies and ideas on this. And even though he's playing at 1,000,000 miles an hour, there's a lot of restraint shown, like you said. There's a lot of really tasteful things being done there. And it's cool. I miss that era of Jordan Rudess's playing in Dream Theater. Like you said, technically speaking, he's an accomplished musician. He has the rare ability to where whatever he's thinking, he can play, and that's awesome.
Yeah,
but,
make it reality.
But from a composition standpoint, I haven't, at least me personally, there could be 1,000 other people out there for every one of me who don't like it, who love what he's doing. But for me, that's something where I feel like it's been missing on subsequent albums.
Yeah, it's funny that it's like, just I guess as a brief aside, all of my favorite Rudess playing from really the last decade of Dream Theater have been those kind of one-off parts. Like I remember like the song "Along for the Ride," and he does like the Moog solo, and it's like a total like Keith Emerson solo, but it's awesome and it's cool and it's got this great melody and just the sound he used, the patch is perfect. It just sounds great. And I think there was a lot of that style of playing on this record specifically.
Oh, yeah.
And that's kind of why I gravitate towards that, And then obviously I think he would be underused on Train of Thought for as much as I love that record. And then would come back swinging on Octavarium. I think he's all over Octavarium, and it's amazing.
Oh, yeah.
And the solo, and what solo I'm talking about in the song Octavarium is one of, I think, the best synth solos of all time. I'd put it right up there with Take the Time and Kevin Moore. Just incredible solo. But yeah, no, so I definitely agree.
Awesome. So, yeah, if you haven't had a chance to listen to this album yet, hopefully a couple drunk dudes rambling on haven't dissuaded you from it too much. In the overall hierarchy of Dream Theater, it's not the absolute best album they've ever done, but it's definitely worth a listen. It's a snapshot of where that band was at that point in time. I think it's really strong. It's not a perfect album, but it's got a lot of things going for it, and it's definitely worth a listen, and I know I've enjoyed listening to it over the last week or so.
Yeah, no, I would strongly recommend, checking it out. Really, that's the cool thing about a band like Dream Theater to me. You really can't go wrong. Any of their records, even the newer records, there's something to like on all of them. And I think that era that we've kind of spent the last hour talking about, from Scenes from a Memory to Octavarium, has some really interesting ideas on there, and I think a lot of what they did on those records has kind of gone to shape the climate of progressive metal now, our contemporary 2020s progressive metal, progressive rock scene. So definitely give it a check, or give it a listen, and hopefully you enjoy it and find as much enjoyment from it as we have in the past and the present and will in the future.
Cool. So we're back. We'll be posting more regularly. Had a week off. Turns out having a kid is kind of a drain on your time. So we'll be back with more videos over the next few weeks. Stay tuned. Be sure to like, subscribe. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks.